Hello, and welcome to the sixth webinar in our series based on the new Oxford University Press book, Putting Purpose into Practice. Last week, we discussed the power of investment to achieve purpose. You can watch the session recording on our website, purposeintopractice.org. The topic of today's webinar is Education and the Economics of Mutuality. It will last for 1 hour, including a Q&A section at the end. Please submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function at any point during the session. We will be focusing on chapters 2, 3, and 6, which you can read online for free at purposeintopractice.org. Following the webinar, feel free to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #PurposeIntoPractice. On Wednesday next week, we will be considering the idea of corporate purpose as a new investment model. We hope you can join us. I will now hand over to the book's co-editor, who will introduce you to today's speakers. Colin Mayer, CBE, is Peter Moore's Professor of Management Studies at Saïd Business School. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to this, the fifth webinar in the series. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. To date, in the first 4 sessions, we've looked at the purpose of business, enacting and embedding purpose in business, measuring purpose, and investing for purpose. The first session brought out the urgency of the agenda of putting purpose at the heart of business and ensuring that the principles of the economics of mutuality are used to embed purpose in their core activities. It discussed what it takes for companies to bring about the necessary reforms that are required to place purpose at the heart of their businesses. The second session then looked at how to do that in practice and how the adoption of meaningful challenges and solving the problems of people and planet profitably can be implemented in organizations. It looked at what that means in terms of the formulation of corporate strategy and the enacting of purpose throughout organizations. We discussed the process of ecosystem mapping and management, which is key to the adoption of purpose in organizations. The third session looked at the measurement of purpose, discussed how systems of standardization of metrics are emerging and the implications of that for the adoption of purpose in businesses. It also looked at what was required for companies to be able to measure purpose within their organizations and ecosystems and ensure that the resources required to implement it are available. And that theme of measurement was then taken up in last week's session, which looked at investment and what is required to get investment flows from institutions to really help companies support their activities in delivering purpose. We discussed the important role that ESG plays in this space and the extent to which there are limitations to the extent that ESG is really delivering the necessary requirements to encourage companies to adopt purpose, because the notion of purpose is not the same as that of ESG. It's really a business model as to how do you create value associated with the notion of solving problems. It's not just about looking at metrics to evaluate the extent to which companies are addressing environmental or social questions. It's about how companies can adopt business practices that really help to create value for their shareholders, as well as for societies and environments around the world. And institutions, financial institutions, have a key role to play in that. Well, today we're turning to a subject that is very close to my heart as a first professor in the business school in Oxford, the Saïd Business School, and then the Dean of the Business School. I've been working in the sphere of business education for a long period of time. And the question as to how do you really promote the education of business leaders, of the next generation and the current generation is critical to the adoption of purpose in business. And what can we expect from the business education community going forward in terms of really assisting with making this idea of promoting purposeful business a reality, and one that aspiring leaders and existing leaders want to take on and know how to implement in their businesses. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Bruno Roche, who is the founder and leader of the Economics of Mutuality platform. He was the former chief economist at Mars Incorporated and head of Mars Catalyst. And he is, of course, the co-editor of the book of Putting Purpose into Practice. So over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Colin, for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I think the topic of today is actually one of the most important one. There is an old saying that goes back 3,000 years ago, which says that people perish because of lack of knowledge. And so the notion of knowledge, the notion of passing knowledge and educating the current and next generation of leaders is at the heart of the Economics of Mutuality program. And in a sense, it's also about understanding that the delivery of purpose at the level of an organization can only happen if this notion of purpose is also embedded and also enacted and practiced at the level of the individuals that are actually leading organizations. So I'm very pleased today to introduce two friends of the Economics of Mutuality program, and also two accomplished academics in their own rights. Anne Florini, who is a professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management in Washington, D.C. She is a former professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, former professor of Singapore Management University. She's an expert on governance and public-private collaboration. And she's also a founding board member of the Economics of Mutuality Foundation. And she has spoken at a number of past Economics of Mutuality events. Thank you for being here, Anne, and welcome. And it is also my great pleasure to introduce to Marie-Laure Salles, who is currently the director of the Geneva Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. She's a former founding dean of the School of Management at Sciences Po in Paris. She's an expert on economic sociology, globalization, and governance. She's also a founding board member of the Economics of Mutuality Foundation, and she hosted a number of Economics of Mutuality events, including a class that we was taught for the last 3 years at Sciences Po, and an event that was focusing on new prosperities. Welcome, Marie-Laure, and very welcome to both Anne and Marie-Laure. But I would like to start with a question to you, if it's okay, Colin. We had a chance actually to work for almost the last 7-8 years together, and you have been a long-time champion of this concept of Economics of Mutuality at Oxford University, and you also have a lot of experience now, both in the education of EOM, but also of the education of MBA students, and also the EOM approach and the education of corporate leaders through a partnership we set up together. So my first question will be, what do you see as the main challenges and also the opportunities of educating both the next generation and also the current generation of business leaders in that space? And the second question is also, would be related to the first one, and can you tell a little bit more about the new Economics of Mutuality MBA courses that you are planning to teach later on this year?
Well, thank you very much, Bruno, for raising that. I think that it is a major challenge for business schools to be adopting this form of teaching, because as we've been discussing in the course of these sessions, what we're talking about is a transformation in business practice, a transformation in the way in which businesses conceive of themselves, conceive of the way in which they need to operate, and the way in which they need to be led. And to underpin that business transformation, we need to really have as fundamental a transformation of business education as we are looking at in business. And the reason for that is that the way in which we have structured business education is very much around the dominant paradigm that exists in business, which is, of course, going back the 60 years to the original Milton Friedman doctrine, the notion that there is only one social purpose of business: to increase profit so long as it stays within the rules of the game. Now, that has been as much the basis of business education courses in at least most business schools around the world as it has been in business practice and in business policy. And to bring about the change that is necessary to ensure that the current and next generation of leaders get the type of education which allows them to adopt the business practices, the innovations in business practices that are needed, requires a really quite fundamental shift in the nature in which we structure our business courses. And let me just characterize how most business school courses run at the moment. Basically, they start off by saying that the purpose of business is to maximize shareholder value. The role of business management is to create and promote value for their shareholders. And the rest of business school courses basically follow from that in terms of the way in which they structure their accounting, their finance, their marketing, their strategy, operations management, etc. courses. Now, what putting purpose at the heart of business requires is to turn that approach on its head and to start off by posing the question, what is the purpose of business? Why does business exist? Why is it created? What is it there to do? And then everything should follow from that. The accounting, finance, etc. courses should be consequential on what one identifies as being the purpose of business. And one point that one wants to emphasize in the process of doing that is that there isn't a right answer to the question, what is the purpose of business? The notion that the purpose of business is about solving profitable solutions, the problems of people and planet, is essentially a menu from which one then selects what a particular purpose it for a specific company is. And that means that one's looking for a multiplicity of purposes and also a multiplicity of structures, organizations, and business practices to deliver on that. And so it creates a much richer notion of what business education is all about. So that's why I think it's quite a challenge for business schools to really create the type of environment that is required to provide the new education. In terms of courses, what I've been doing for a number of years in Oxford is to run a course on the nature of the corporation, which puts purpose at the heart of it. But what we're doing this year is, in conjunction with the Economics of Mutuality, to really bring in the principles of Economics of Mutuality to be a core component of the way in which I then treat the education of putting purpose into practice, and in particular, to use the notion of what it means to adopt the Economics of Mutuality as the way of implementing purpose in business. So it's going to be a very exciting course this summer when we're really going to bring all of the resources of the Economics of Mutuality program that we've been researching together, first with the Mars Corporation and then with the Economics of Mutuality Foundation over the last 7 years, to bring all of the resources and knowledge that we've acquired from that into this course and see whether or not one can really create something that lays the foundation for the new type of education.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. And I just, before we move to Anne and Marie-Laure, I just would like to ask you one other question. Is that you've been witnessing actually the evolution of management education over the last decades. And what evolution do you see specifically from what the students are acquiring from the business schools? But also, do you see also a similar evolution among the companies that are expecting a new type of leadership?
Yes, both, frankly. A marked change in attitude on the part of students in relation to what they're expecting of the MBA courses and the other master's courses that they get in a business school, where there is now a recognition that the nature of business is changing substantially, and they want to be at the forefront of what is needed to equip them to be able to deliver that in the companies that they then go and work for. So there's a lot of pressure for change that is coming from the student body. There is also a lot of change that is coming from what companies are looking for. So executive education courses are now increasingly focusing on, in particular in relation to customized courses for companies, on the subject of how do they educate their business leaders, their executives, in terms of adopting and implementing purpose in their companies. And we're experiencing in Oxford a rapid growth in the number of executive education courses that we're delivering on exactly that topic. And one of the first that we did develop was, again, in conjunction with you and the Economics of Mutuality, in terms of providing an executive education course on that subject, initially for people in Mars, and now it's broadening out to other companies as well. So a great growth in demand from both students and companies.
Thank you very much, Colin. Now I'd like to turn to you, Marie-Laure. So when you were the dean at Sciences Po in Paris, you pioneered actually a condensed 6 weeks semester course on precisely this topic for master's degree students. And can you just tell us why you decided to integrate this type of teaching into the curriculum of Sciences Po, and how would you interpret the impact it had on business learnings among the students when it was delivered?
Thank you very much, Bruno. Good evening, Bruno. Good evening, everybody. Good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much for this question. Well, it was quite an obvious decision, really, because there was so much coherence between the framing of the course and what the course was going to try to achieve on the one hand, and on the other hand, the project of the new school that I was building at Sciences Po. The coherence came from the fact that both the school and the course really started from, in a sense, the premise that purpose should be at the heart of value creation, value production. In fact, if you put it a bit further, the idea was that there's no value, no real value creation that does not integrate, and I think it remains very true today, that does not integrate solutions to contemporary challenges. If we believe that we can produce value without integrating solutions to contemporary challenges at the heart, actually, of business, we are making really huge mistakes, and we are already paying the price of those mistakes, which have been with us for many, many decades, and it's more than urgent, naturally, to change that. So in a sense, really, it was very obvious for me to recognize the philosophy, in a sense, of the course as very compatible, very coherent with the project of the school. So it made full sense to integrate. Other way to say the same thing is that, and this is really something that I was deeply convinced when I launched the school at Sciences Po, is that we need to integrate at the heart of business education the notion that long-term is really needed in our tools, in our strategic decision-making processes and mechanisms, so that long-term projections really need to drive short-term decision-making, which is a totally reverse projection from what has been happening in the past, in the same way that Colin underscored, obviously the other one that is better known, the notion that self-interest is not driving common good. This is something clear. We have seen that. On the other hand, the dealing with common good challenges and common good issues is the only condition, is a very important prerequisite to us individually being able to enjoy a good life in the future. So I think this is really a changing paradigm. It's really as deep as that. And I think that both the school that I created at Sciences Po was carrying this sense that in fact this is not, purpose is not just something that is nice to have, an afterthought, but really something that needs to be at the heart of value creation in companies and at the heart of pedagogical rethinking of our business schools in general. I think it played, to go back to your second question, Bruno, what role and what impact did this course have on the school? It really was totally integrated in an overall rethinking of our curriculum. And in that sense, it played its important role together with all the other pieces of the puzzle, I would say. So it was really very important to the overall architecture that transformed our curriculum in the few years that we worked together there.
So let me build on something you just said at the beginning of your answer. You are trained as a sociologist, and you're also an expert in North American culture and how it relates also to this kind of issue. So maybe kind of a bit of a question on the spot. How do you see the evolution actually of this education? So to take into account the society, to take into account the environment and integrate it into a business model approach. How do you see it actually playing with the North American culture and maybe more generally the Western culture vis-a-vis actually other forms of culture? We may actually have a different approach to addressing these kind of issues like China and even other part of the world.
Well, you shouldn't launch me on this because this could last forever. Obviously, what is really important to realize is that the way in which we train decision makers in general is very connected to dominant frameworks and particularly dominant geopolitical frameworks, but also dominant economic frameworks. And, we can summarize this a bit shortly by saying the 20th century has been the American century. This is very clear. And in fact, the contemporary institutional setting for business education is a child of America, very much so. It's very much, we've had the exportation of that model together with the exportation of the US economic model across the world, and with variants of that through the years. Obviously, the US model of the 1930s was very different from the US economic model of the 1980s, 90s. And the shareholder model that really imposed itself from the 1970s forward was really a strong evolution from what the US economic model had been in the 1930s. But really the business, and Colin has said that very, very clearly already, I shouldn't repeat that, the business education system has been built on that paradigm and has, increased its role, its place together with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of China, etc. So there's been progressive diffusion of that particular way of training elites and training decision makers. So I think as we move into the 20th century, everything needs to be reinvented, basically. So obviously, China is a big player today. What will the geopolitical game lead us towards? A Chinese century, maybe something else? Who knows? Maybe my dream, a European/Swiss alternative, a third way that would actually come together with the necessary reinvention of decision makers and leadership training in general, and not only economic, but really, we need new ways, new disciplines, new pedagogies, new perspectives to train our future leaders. That's very clear.
Yeah, and actually, it's a nice segue to the next question I have for you, Marie-Laure. I mean, you're moving now into, you know, the head of this institute in Geneva, which actually is, I believe, the oldest institute for international relations in Europe, and it has a long history of being actually of training the elite for the managing multilateralism and recently also for addressing economic development issues. And as I'm moving into that space in this wonderful city of Geneva, which is essentially based on, yeah, I mean, on the management of multilateralism, but also the power of finance. So how do you see actually this concept of what you're talking about, of responsible business, reciprocity in the economy? How do you see it playing out, not only in the area of finance, but also in the area of reinventing, in a sense, the notion of multilateralism? I know it's a long topic, and we have a few minutes for this, but I just like to pick your brain and so you can actually, yeah, draw some lines so that we can think about it.
Okay, I guess I'll you know, obviously this would take forever again, but I'll say one word only. I think it's the word of interdependence, which I think is extremely important and which puts, I think, Geneva really right there on the map. I think that we are not going to solve those global challenges independently, business on its own, NGOs on their own, international organizations on their own, states on their own, us individuals on their own. What is very clear is that there needs to be a collaboration and interdependent action between all those actors together in a coordinated kind of way. And it's true that Geneva has, you know, a great advantage that it brings together large numbers of international organizations and big actors of multilateralism that themselves are very conscious that multilateralism needs to be reshaped, reinvented, transformed, whatever is the term. We also have obviously a strong financial sector that is extremely ready also to accept that finance has to go back to its traditional role, which is a mechanism, a tool for the creation of value and not an end in itself, as it may have been too much in the past few decades. And so this is really something that the financial sector in Geneva right now is really starting to really push for increasingly. So this notion of finance for impact, not finance for itself. And we have, you know, important institutions of education, and we are here today to talk about the role of education, the role of training the new generations in that direction. Indeed, the Institute historically is the oldest institution in the world, I would say, you know, with a focus on international relation. It was born as a kind of sister organization to some degree with the League of Nations, with the objective of training the first decision makers of the international world dealing with global challenges. This is as relevant and even more relevant than ever. We know that the challenges we're facing are completely global. We know we need collaboration. We know we need multilateralism, maybe of a different kind than the one we have today. And we know that this multilateralism has to work with the private sector, has to work with states, has to work with citizens and NGOs and activists everywhere. So yeah, that's a wonderful challenge.
Yeah, well, thank you, Marie-Laure. I know there is already a lot of questions in the chat room, so we will keep them for the end. But I know I'd like to turn to Anne. So Anne, I mean, we had a chance to meet several years ago when you were in Asia, and I remember vividly some of our conversations. So can you just share with us what at that time attracted you to this concept of economics of mutuality, and what has made you continue to champion it in your current role in the US? And in a sense, maybe I would like to say that given you have a good understanding now of both sides of the of Asia and the Western world, where do you see the benefit of each, in a sense, culture in enacting these kind of concepts? And if you talk about the comparative advantage of nations, what would be the comparative advantage of the US, for instance, the Western world, versus the comparative advantage of Asia and China regarding this concept of economics of mutuality and responsible business practices? I know it's a long question, but I know you are very good at synthesizing your thinking.
Okay, thanks, Bruno. And thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in what I think is a really important session, because the importance of this session is exactly what attracted me to the EOM thinking in the first place, which is you are the answer to a major problem that I had. When we first met about a decade ago, I was giving talks. I was in Singapore, then running a center at the Public Policy School, because I come from a policy background at the National University of Singapore. But I was giving talks to businesses, financial institutions, government agencies, all on what are the world's big problems and how are we going to solve them. And one of the talks that I gave was at a major Western bank. Must have been 100 senior bankers in the room. And I was talking about, here's the global agenda, we need finance to be participating. And the reaction was very skeptical. This isn't the role of finance, we have our own concerns, this is the role of governments. Until after the talk. And after the talk, half the audience came up and crowded around me and said, we know you're right, we know that finance isn't contributing what it needs to be contributing, we know there's a major problem with the business sector, we want to do something different, but we are so constrained. We are hamstrung in what we are able to do. So from my perspective of global governance, how do you solve the world's big problems? I didn't have an answer for the bankers. I didn't have a model that I could point to that would say, there is another way of thinking about what your role is. And to me, the economics of mutuality has provided answers that I then did not have. So then there's the question of why was I talking to bankers at all at that point, if what I was interested in was the question of how are we going to solve the big problems, the climate change, the financial volatility, the lack of equality, et cetera. Well, for some time, it has been clear that we cannot expect that governments are going to solve the world's problems. When I first started in my career, I was in international relations. You constantly heard the refrain that if only governments had political will, they could agree on this, that, and the other. Well, it was very obvious that they don't, and that they often lack capacity to do a lot of the problem solving as well. So I started looking at the questions of what about the other social sectors? What about civil society? And what about the role of business? So for the last few decades, I've been writing and teaching and advising on what roles should each of these sectors play, and how do they work together, which I think is one of the most important parts of your new book. That the recognition that you have to have effective partnerships across these three sectors if we're actually going to deal with the world's challenges. And it seems to me that what Economics of Mutuality does is makes business a fit partner for government and civil society in solving society's problems. One of the problems that we've had with professional education, not just management, business education, but professional education across the board, is that we've been teaching these ideas that business has very limited, narrow remit, government has its own remit, civil society has its own, and they are very separate. In management education and in public policy education, which is my field, we do not teach those students about the other sectors. So when you go into government, you don't have an understanding of business. In business schools, government is at best that thing out there that regulates you and doesn't really understand how you function. That's not, of course, how the real world operates, but it's very much the mindset, as Marie-Laure was referring to, that we have been entrenching for decades now, because our professional education around the world has really been modeled on what was developed in the United States, which was an extreme version of this model of the separation of the social spheres. So people in business have lots of stories about how regulators fail to understand them, but the converse is also true. People in business don't understand the pressures that government is under or that civil society organizations that are trying to solve problems are under, and they don't have a deep understanding of what those problems are. Unfortunately, these kinds of entrenched mindsets fit badly with reality. We're living in a world of interlocking fragilities in our political, economic, natural systems. And that calls out for systemic approaches, not for narrow optimization around whatever we have decided we want to optimize and just ignoring everything else. And it cries out for partnerships across the sectors, as the book describes. When you and I first met, Bruno, this was before the Sustainable Development Goals. But one of the things that the UN Sustainable Development Goals does that I think really validates the EOM approach, as well as the partnerships that I think are so important, is that they say that the only way to achieve these great goals is through partnerships across the sector. We're beginning now to see that that's become legitimized, although we still need to know a lot better how to do it. But when I first encountered the Economics of Mutuality, the policy school at the National University of Singapore would not admit graduate students who had business backgrounds because they weren't considered to be policy relevant. That's something I fought very hard to change. I then moved to a different university to create a mid-career master's program on how do you do partnerships, which was underway when we were first talking. And the reason that I went to the Thunderbird School of Global Management rather than other kinds of business schools in the United States is because Thunderbird, from its inception in the 1940s, was set up as a different kind of management education. It was one that was focused around culture and language and understanding international affairs fully as much as it was around understanding business and business skills. So for me, it's been a perfect platform for my ongoing efforts to figure out how do you transform professional education across the board so it meets the 21st century realities. And now, of course, like Oxford and others, we're expanding into exec ed and other forms of training and education, because it isn't enough to train people who are future leaders. We have to be talking to the people who are the leaders now. We don't have enough time to wait another 20 or 30 years for people with different mindsets to get into positions of influence. And the final point on this is, it was really striking to me going through the book, which I've read in detail, the degree to which Economics of Mutuality aligns with virtually everything in the program I'm now co-leading in Washington, which is an Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management. Managing complex systems is a core pillar of our curriculum. Ecosystems and orchestration of ecosystems lines up perfectly with the courses that we teach on networks and global affairs, and understanding the language of the different sectors. As you know, I've been teaching and trying to get my head around these questions of metrics and measurement for these much broader requirements for business, which is still very much of a problem. And so it seems to me that people coming out of policy backgrounds, people coming out of business backgrounds, really need to be working together on rethinking all of professional education, not focusing only on the business schools.
Well, thank you very much, because here you're connecting different points. And it is true actually that the more we talk about multilateralism and the more we talk about the connection between government and private sector, it shows actually that even the notion of multilateralism is evolving quite quickly. So multilateralism is not only across nation states, it also involves large organizations like multinational corporations, large foundations, but also increasingly also civil society. And actually, I think there is something called the internet or the social network, which actually is creating a force in itself. So it's true actually that the notion of multilateralism is changing. So there are different players, and essentially the solutions to the problem that we have requires actually a much more complex response than just silo-based solutions, such as like maximizing profit for shareholder. But I have actually, in that context, I have two additional questions for you. And the first one is, it's true that Ronald Reagan started in the 80s by saying that government is not the solution, government is the problem, right? And essentially, it seems to me that if there is one thing that the COVID is changing among many other things, is actually the role of government. And it's not only just a European or an Asian phenomenon, it's also a US phenomenon. So I'd like to hear, especially from your policy-making perspective, how do you see, how do you interpret the comeback of government after decades of withdrawal? And is it going something that actually is just for curing this health crisis, or do you see actually in the psyche, in the sociology of the civil society in the Western world as a more permanent shift that actually could shape the way we do business and we envisage prosperity in the coming years?
I think it's very clear that we're seeing the return of the state in a very major way. And it's not just because of the pandemic. The pandemic really crystallized a whole lot of stuff. But it's going to be a different kind of state. You know, with what's happened over the last 40, 50 years, with this constant pressure of take everything away from government, put it in the hands of the private sector, markets know best, there are certain kinds of problems that just aren't solved that way. In fact, most of the major fragilities that we are now facing are the result of assuming that the end goal of everything was extreme economic efficiency. But efficiency is just a means. The goals are prosperity and well-being and sustainability. We've, I think, gone past the end of the road for the extreme focus on old-fashioned business models that are purely profit-focused, and models that assume that economic efficiency is what you should be aiming for at the cost of everything else. Because another way of thinking about efficiency is fragility, that you strip out all the resilience, you strip out all the buffers. States can't afford to do that. They did it anyhow, and we have, as a result, ended up with more fragile societies. So we're really seeing that there's a role for what government needs to do that isn't what business does normally. But we're also seeing, as I said, because of this growing focus on business purpose that EOM is so wonderfully leading, there's an opportunity to reimagine what is it that we actually want business to do and what is it that we actually want government to do and how do they work together? And how do they work together in ways that don't degenerate into crony capitalism, which is always a danger. Partnership needs to be serving social ends, not private ends. And so thinking through what is going to be the role of government, what's going to be the role of business, how do civil society organizations fit into it? To me, this is one of the great challenges we face right now.
Well, thank you. Maybe one last question on this topic, actually, which is the role of finance. Today, actually, finance is, I was just watching the other day that there is one company, I will not name it, but which actually has more than 8 trillion of assets under management. And actually, one organization, one private organization alone, has the equivalent of 50% of the GDP of a block of countries as the EU. So I know you have a passion for transforming the financial sector to be a force for responsible investing that promotes change in business behavior. So how do you see that space, that investment space evolving in the coming decade? And what is actually the risk of having the finance sector stepping in? And what would be the role of education, in a sense, to bring finance, as you said, to be in service of the economy and the economy to be in service of society?
Let me start the answer to that with a story. So when I was teaching in Singapore, and I was teaching a course on what we then called corporate social responsibility, one of the students in my class was a finance major. So she was just taking my class as an elective on the side. And for one of the case studies, it just by chance happened to be a case study that was also being used in a finance course. And of course, I was giving her the broad think, systemic context, what, depending on what actions you take, what are going to be the consequences. And she got all excited about that. And she went to her finance professor and she wanted to write up her case study analysis for that same case, or a related case, I think it was, using that kind of thinking. And he told her that if she did, he would flunk her, he would fail her, because that was not finance. That I don't think would happen in most places now. And part of the reason it wouldn't happen now is because financial regulators and central banks are now starting to take on much broader thinking about what is threatening to the financial sector itself, which is all this stuff that the finance sector has systematically ignored over time. So we have the network of central bank governors on greening the financial system. We have the G20 that for quite a while now has had a track in the finance minister's track focused on greening the financial system, not setting aside some green bonds, although green bonds are still growing, but how do you transform the entire sector? Now, if the regulators are thinking like that, there's no question but that the financial private sector is also going to be paying a lot more attention to things that they hadn't paid attention to. But I think even more important are the kind of people that I was speaking with at that bank in Singapore. There's a lot of people in the financial sector who have been told for a very long time that they weren't allowed to think about other things, that it wasn't their remit, that they went and got their MBAs and were told that their fiduciary responsibility was only about earning profits. That's not what they're hearing anymore, or it's not the only thing that they're hearing anymore. In terms of what's actually going to happen, we're hearing a whole lot about reporting and disclosure. We're hearing a whole lot about ESG performance, environmental, social governance performance. And as you said earlier, and as Colin said earlier, we really need something much more profound for the financial sector. ESG just says, let's not do any more active environmental and social damage. Well, that's great, but it seems to be a very minimal starting point. So I think there's very good chance that we're going to see significant change in the financial sector that goes well beyond what we're currently talking about with ESG and reporting.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have like 15 minutes left to our webinar, and I'd like to leave the floor to some questions. So we have already a few questions from the Q&A platform. Nick, would you please to share them, and let's see if Marie-Laure or Anne would like to respond.
Thank you, Bruno. Yes, we've had a few questions come in, and please do continue to type them into the Q&A box, which is available at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we've got, 10, 15 minutes to hear some responses. So the first question we've had is, how can business practitioners best assist in persuading business school institutions to embed more purposeful topics into the curriculum?
I can give the slightly cynical answer, which is when you're making contributions, you talk to the leadership of the school and say, hey, this is what I'm interested in. If you're going to make a significant contribution, if you're going to endow a chair or just give a small grant, to be having conversations with the leadership, not telling them what they must do, because you don't want to be interfering with academic freedom, but to be supportive of changes that take on much more of a really broad sense of understanding corporate purpose. That gets listened to, and that gets listened to very rapidly. Beyond that, in terms of any kind of engagement that you're doing, whether it's hiring graduates, you talk to the faculty and say, these are the kinds of people I'm looking for with these kinds of skills. Why aren't you offering courses that are relevant for the kind of people that I want to hire, the kind of people I want to give internships to? It's not a difficult conversation to have, because business schools have to be responsive to their alumni as well as to the incoming students. And as Colin said, incoming students are already putting pressure to develop these kinds of courses that may need some different kind of hiring or different kind of incentive structures for the faculty, but it's entirely doable.
And
thank you, and perhaps Marie-Laure would like to answer as well. Thank you.
I'll just really build on what Anne has said, to say that again, it's maybe not a question of assisting. Maybe the word is not the right word, but really a question of working together again. I think it's really an interdependency issue. So we know, and it's quite clear to me, particularly with respect to finance, in fact, where theories, and I see that one of the other questions is actually going a bit along the same way. Theories are really deeply ingrained, and the ways in which generations of faculties are being reproduced takes actually quite a long time. So to some degree, actually, business practitioners have to face changes in a faster kind of way. And so they can be very useful there in actually telling business school professors or professors in general, that indeed the world is changing, and that indeed it's fine to reinvent the ways in which we are teaching, the way in which we are creating curricula, etc. This is kind of, it seems weird, but it seems to be that this is really an interesting dynamic today, which is that actually professors will need the okay from the world of practice in order to be a bit bolder in the ways in which they will change their courses. So I would, I would see it that way. If practitioners can come and tell us, yes, this is really what you need to do. This is really what we need to work together on, because we need your theoretical sophistication to deal with some of the very practical issues we're facing as the world is telling us to change in that direction. Then we have the kind of very, very positive interdependencies and complementarities that we should have in all our schools, whether business schools or policy schools or international relations schools.
Thank you. We've had another question which asks, how do we manage the transition and support new graduates with the updated education and intent as they step into businesses that are most likely to not yet be putting purpose into practice?
I can start if you want on this, because this is something that I've had actually I've had to think a lot about for many, many years now as dean in different schools. And I think it's getting easier and easier. So that's the good news. It was really tough at the beginning when you try to actually bring people out there with a kind of critical perspective on the dominant solutions or mainstream solutions that were used in different forms of organizations. It was indeed very difficult for them. It was actually putting them maybe in a tough spot where they were coming with strong convictions about a number of things that really did not play out in the real world. Today, it's really easier. It's still not completely easy, but it's much easier because indeed, as we said, the world of practice, the world of business, the world of international organizations, all employers today are very convinced theoretically, in at least in terms of the overall talk, that things have to change. So in a sense, it's easier for the new generations to come in and say, well, we've learned those tools and those tools really call to, correspond to the types of evolutions of issues that you are facing. And so why don't we actually put our minds together to see how we can apply them very concretely? So I think that, there is really a sense now that, there's a mainstreaming essentially of this perspective, which makes it easier for individuals. It's also easier as more and more schools are training people in that way. So more and more young people are really getting into companies and into organizations with this kinds of mindset. So, I think time is helping there. Time and the pressure of the environment, the urgent pressures of the environment are really big helping factors.
I agree with all of that. The only thing that I would add is that it's entirely possible to teach people about how you do this kind of business transformation and give them the language and the skills about how you translate that into things that seem less strange to people who have been thoroughly embedded in the more conventional way of thinking about business. If you think, for example, about why it is that central banks started looking at the finance sector and the risks of climate change and other kinds of instability, they didn't start off by saying, this is because we need the finance sector to adopt purpose. They started off by saying, these are actual risks to the stability of the financial sector. And you can do that, I think, with pretty much any business now. If business continues to ignore the broader realities and the broader fragilities, business is threatened by that quite directly, and profits are threatened by that quite directly. So you have ways that you can start the conversation that are really pretty straightforward. It may take a while for some people to really understand what is meant by economics of mutuality and what is meant by a purpose-driven business. And some people will never accept it and never agree with it. But I think it's not that hard to start the conversation as long as we in academia provide the kinds of frameworks and tools and language and skills that make it possible for our graduates to do that kind of translation.
We have actually an interesting question from one of the attendants. He said, well, I'm going to read it. Given that orthodox assumptions are now fundamentally questioned, how are academics planning to teach better future critique of tools and theories used in business, finance, and economics, including their underlying disciplinary assumption? So it's a very interesting big question, because it's all about actually how the capacity of the academic institutions in management schools to essentially not only be in a critical mode of their own assumptions, but also to, in a sense, lead the way and shaping lead the way in the and shape the future, instead of, in a sense, commenting or describing the existent. So who wants to answer this question?
It's an easy one for me to answer because we're doing it. So in both the master's programs that I created in Singapore and in the US, the core theoretical paradigm is not your standard business paradigm. It's managing complex systems, complex adaptive systems. And if you start with that, and the instructor in both cases is this really wonderful Dutchman named Roland Coopers, who spent 20 years in industry before really turning into someone who teaches people about the management of complex systems, which is not, of course, what business schools normally teach. The importance of this is that it lays out three paradigms. What are the kinds of problems that can be solved hierarchically by a government coming in and saying, do X, Y, and Z? And there are some problems you actually want to solve that way. What are the kinds of problems that you want to solve through pure market forces with no consideration of broader purpose? And then what are the kinds of problems that actually are complex systems, unpredictable, nonlinear, all the major problems that we currently face? And what are the methods that you use to solve those problems? Once you lay out that kind of paradigm, it becomes clear that the standard business profit maximization approach is just one small set of a whole set of tools that society has available to deal with its issues, and that businesses have available as well. So we have already the conceptual basis, and we're seeing this pop up over and over and over again. We're now seeing see asset managers talking about complex system management. It already exists. We have to be, I think, explicit about including it in our curricula so that our students and the mid-career people that we are educating realize that there are, in fact, other paradigms well developed out there. Economics of Mutuality is fundamentally based on this understanding of complex systems. It's part of what I found so compelling about it from the beginning. We have this already. We don't need to invent it. We just need to include it in the way we're teaching and training.
Can I jump on this? Because I think this has always been also something that I've been giving a lot of thought to, because indeed, one of the important next steps, and I think I agree with Anne that we've made progress, and I agree that we've started to think differently and bring along different paradigms, but we haven't really deeply questioned, at least in the context of business schools, deeply questioned the performativity of our theories, at least not enough. And so I think that this is really a very important step. The only way I've found, I think the only way that exists to do that is really to have the capacity to deconstruct our theories as bodies of knowledge that have been contextually constructed with certain objectives and that are therefore not universal in any way. And in order to do that, the best mechanism really is transdisciplinarity, and in particular, bringing in more social sciences into the business schools, more humanities into the business schools, arts, other perspectives that decenter the way in which we look at our own intellectual constructions. And in fact, it was a bit, the anecdote that Anne gave of the student in Singapore was really a bit showing that. So I think that if we are going to do that, we have to open up the business school, in a sense, intellectual agenda much more broadly than it is now. I have to admit that's one of the reasons why I left the world of the business school and why I went to a social science and humanities university, because I felt that it was much easier to do that where I am than it is to do it still in the business school, even though you have to admit that there's been significant progress in the last 3-4 years in that direction. So yeah, I think it's a very important question. Thank you for asking it, in fact.
Thank you, Marie-Laure. We're coming to the end of today's session, so I just wanted to say a big thank you for all of your contributions, which have been incredibly insightful. And I wanted to end with a quote from John Keynes, which highlights the importance of business education. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical persons who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. We hope that you will join us next Wednesday for a webinar about corporate purpose as a new investment model. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.